Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Upgrades are on the way as the top teams try and find a way to take down McLaren and their incredibly strong tyre wear performance that they've shown over the first couple of weekends and the championship lead they currently have in both championships. Mercedes feel like they may well be best positioned to challenge McLaren for the title this year, but Ferrari have a few upgrades on the works which they believe can get back to the type of performance that they showed in the sprint race on Saturday at the most recent Chinese Grand Prix. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. So much to get into today. Again, we pretty much have to start with the driver drama because that is not going away. Jack Doohan is expected to be replaced by Franco Colapinto at some point. He's not had a good couple of races, really. I don't think we necessarily expected it. The Alpine is also worse than maybe we thought it might be. During testing, my feeling was the Williams was going to be a bit stronger than the Alpine. I think the general Formula 1 community was kind of split on where it would be. Turns out though, yeah. And also, Gasly got disqualified as well. Wasn't in the points, but still got disqualified. Of course, neither was Doohan. He picked up some penalty points as well. Crashed out in Australia. You know, it's only a matter of time, I think, until Colapinto will be given the drive. Now, yesterday, of course, we heard rumours that maybe Colapinto could go to Red Bull, or at least he could go to the Racing Bulls team if Tsunoda was promoted. But, of course, Colapinto can't drive both cars at the same time. So, and more than likely, he will stay at Alpine. I just don't really see why Red Bull would do that. They'd have to pay so much money to get Colapinto. Like, Red Bull had their chance in the off-season when Alpine eventually signed Colapinto as a reserve driver. Like, you know, Red Bull could have got him then if they wanted him. And there were some rumours that they did. But they didn't, so now surely it doesn't make any sense. Most likely, you know, Yuki for Lawson, straight swap is the thing that they might do, but yeah, we'll see. Yuki, of course, is not going to turn down the opportunity as much as Max Verstappen is going to be like, look, Yuki, be careful, this car is very difficult to handle, although it might be faster. But Yuki's like, look, if you give me a faster car, I'll do my best to make it work. And look, if Yuki gets chewed up and spit out as well, then you know, Red Bull are just completely cooked when Verstappen leaves, because clearly they've not designed a machine capable of being driven by anyone effectively but Verstappen or someone on that level of talent and ability. How would he do in the RB21? It is a big question. We are, you know, at this point, we're probably going to get the answer to it, I think. Whether we get the answer to it in Japan, that still remains to be seen as far as I'm concerned. I know David Coulthard was actually talking about this and saying that as far as he's concerned, Lawson has one more attempt in Japan, a circuit that he has some experience in. He raced there with the AlphaTauri, I think, in 2023. He raced there in Super Formula as well. So he at least has some experience in this circuit. If I was Red Bull, I would probably give Lawson at least that Grand Prix. The idea of replacing him before then seems a little bit outrageous, but, you know, this is Red Bull Racing we're talking about. And it would be an incredibly Red Bull thing to do, like, if this is what they end up doing. I think Lawson doesn't help himself either. Like, Lawson's, you know, I would, like, call it on the verge of arrogance in a way, and I don't think that being arrogant as an F1 driver is necessarily a bad thing. Like, I do think you need to have immense confidence in your own abilities. Finally, remember to change the bottom right-hand corner of the screen as well. But the way that Lawson speaks about other drivers, I think often Lawson, he doesn't necessarily big himself up. He takes the approach of putting other drivers down. Like, I don't know, that's just my read on it anyway. I think there's a reason why people aren't really vibing with Liam Lawson, generally speaking. I mean, there's even been videos of him with Verstappen, his own teammate. It doesn't really seem like they're getting along particularly well. So I think that maybe has a part to play as well, because if Lawson comes out and says, like, hey, I'm here to win, and he wins, then sure, great. But if you're not winning, it quickly can turn kind of sour. And Lawson's perspective on Yuki was, oh, like, Yuki's talking trash on me, basically. Oh, well, no surprise there. I beat him in junior categories, and I beat him in F1. But it's like, well, it seems a bit of revisionist history as far as I'm concerned. But whatever, the drivers are going to say what they say. Is it going to help Lawson keep his seat? Kind of doubtful as far as I'm concerned. Reportedly, they are going to analyse the decision this week, Red Bull, and then they're going to make a call as to what they're going to do. But nothing, of course, as yet is officially confirmed. While Red Bull figure that whole thing out, there has been a bit of drama at Williams too, just because Sainz has been, you know, I'd say surprisingly underwhelming compared to Albon so far. Of course, Sainz spun it out underneath the safety car in Australia, which whatever kind of torque he got on the car that he might not be used to because it's a Mercedes engine, fair enough. But still, whenever you spin behind a safety car, that is driver error to some degree as far as I'm concerned. But look, Williams, of course, have had a great start of the season. They were good in testing. Albon has scored a ton of points. I think he's already scored as many points this year, Albon, as he did the entirety of last last season for sure, and Sainz during the Chinese Grand Prix was quite a way off where he would have liked to have been. The overall number of points, the overall position he scored, given all the disqualifications, was perfectly fine, but, where he actually was in terms of pace was not where he wanted to be. And there's been some talk about potentially using an old chassis, because, look, we know that Williams are putting their resources into 2026. It only really makes sense, I would say, for them to do so. But nonetheless, it's not like they've got an old chassis in Sainz's car and a new one in Albon's car. It's actually like the same chassis. It's just a modified version of last year's monocoque. And Albon, though, has got the same one as Sainz. So there's no like grand conspiracy theory here that they're favouring Albon over Sainz. I think they want the best from both of their drivers. And maybe it's expected there'll be some adaptation period from Sainz. But certainly that discrepancy so far has been a serious point of contention. Where are the teams, however? Because Williams are 5th, let's just put them there. But the top 4 teams are clear, assuming that the Red Bull actually is, at least in Verstappen's hands, the Red Bull is quick. So we've got to put them in the conversation too. And Verstappen in the World Championship is still 2nd right now, 8 points behind where Lando presently is. But who's the second fastest team? The answer right now is probably Mercedes. And based on the numbers, that also seems to be true. Verstappen, Red Bull technically, but basically Verstappen, is very close to where the Mercedes are on average pace over the first couple of races. And look, we don't have a massive sample size. We have Australia, we have the sprint in China, and then we have the main race in China. That's all we are going off, really. But based on the numbers, Mercedes so far have the second fastest car to the McLaren. And it's pretty interesting to think about exactly why. It definitely feels like this year the Mercedes is a far more resilient, less volatile car than they've had over the last couple of seasons. And it's kind of what we expected them to do for the last few years. And finally this year they've actually put together a car capable of being a pretty stable base. For example, Antonelli, as good as he is, there have been, you would expect him. Like last year's Mercedes, he crashed it in Monza, right? Like in his FP1 session. Rookie mistakes happen, and the fact that Antonelli really hasn't done any at all, I think is credit to him, sure, as a driver. Like, I'm really excited about his future, but I think it's also showing the car is much more consistent. You guys might remember Austin last year, where both Hamilton and Russell were both immensely struggling with the car, spinning it off into the gravel. Hamilton, was out of the race as well for similar reasons. You think you put a rookie in the car, in last year's car, the same thing would happen as it did in Monza, right, when he crashed out of the practice session there. Not happened so far. Not to say that he won't make rookie mistakes, but the car is clearly much more grounded than it has previously been. Unfortunately for Mercedes, in terms of their title ambitions, they just don't have the outright performance right now. Now, in qualifying, they very nearly did. Russell was, 400th, whatever he was, so he was super tight with Piastri for pole in China. And that's potentially a very exciting sign maybe of things to come for the team as well. But it still remains the tyre management, which is the problem for the Mercedes, or really any team when compared to the McLaren. What's interesting about this to me really is that this was the same reason why the RB19 was an absolute rocket ship, is that it could keep its tyres in a good position for qualifying. But it wasn't great, obviously, the RB19 in qualifying, routinely out-qualified by the Ferrari that year. But in the race, it was a foregone conclusion because the tyres would simply not degrade once they got into the operating window. The McLaren this year seems to manage to do both of those, where it's still very good in qualifying, but it doesn't drop off in the race, which is, something that the other teams have to figure out. The benefit the Mercedes have is that they have fewer problems than the other teams. McLaren are the best, sure. Red Bull have a lot that they've got to think about, not just in terms of making the car better, but also how they think about, do we just do what Max tells us to do for the car, or do we think about what the second driver might want? It's really tough to say. And Ferrari have a load of issues they've got to solve. Fast on their day, Ferrari, but clearly problematic in many regards as well. So it raises the question that maybe Mercedes are actually the best positioned team to challenge for the title this year, because at least they don't really have anything to solve. They just need to add performance, and they need to figure out to try and make their tyre degradation management better. But it's not like their car is all over the place. Their car's very fundamentally solid. They just need a bit more performance. And maybe they can achieve that, right? Mercedes, they finally put together a car. Like McLaren had one last year. Mercedes have put together a car that they're happy with. And it's close to where McLaren are. It's not that far away in the grand scheme of things, right? Russell finished 11 seconds behind Piastri at the end of the Chinese Grand Prix, which is, significant. but it's not outrageous, right? I mean, over entire Grand Prix distance, it's a couple of tenths a second a lap, which is something that Mercedes will be confident that they can find. And, maybe McLaren take a step, and maybe it takes a step back, who knows? So I think Mercedes, as I kind of thought they would be after testing, really, are maybe the team to watch this year, because you look at the championship battle, let's just say from the constructors' perspective, who's actually going to win it this year? Who's going to be the closest challenger to McLaren? I mean, already Mercedes are right there, and I mean, Ferrari would be the other contender you would suggest, because of course Red Bull Racing have one driver, so they're not going to win the constructors. It's only Mercedes, Ferrari or McLaren that can do it, and already Ferrari are 40 points behind Merc. Of course, in the constructors context, that's not really much. That can be overturned in due course, but the way things currently look, are Merc or Ferrari looking to be the closer challengers in the constructors this year to McLaren? I think right now there's only really one answer. Speaking of Ferrari, though, where are they going to go from here? Because, of course, Mercedes are looking to outdevelop, Ferrari and obviously McLaren especially too, although there's not been massive detail on what exactly they're going to do to try and make that happen as of yet. Ferrari have a very clear idea of where they're trying to go. Hamilton is also on the front cover of the new F1 25 game. It's, the iconic edition anyway. It's always interesting, right, given that Max has won the title for the last 4 years in a row, yet, of course, understandably, really, Hamilton and Ferrari remains the story of the season. And it's been an up and down start to the season, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that Hamilton's never letting us know his next move. He, has a horrific Grand Prix in Australia, struggling the whole race behind Albon, turns up to China, sticks on sprint pole, wins the sprint, and then gets disqualified for the Grand Prix with not much pace after the changes they made to the car going into the main set of qualifying. But the risk, of course, and the concern for Ferrari is that they have a fundamental flaw in their car, which means they need to run the car at a certain ride height to generate performance, and that ride height is very much, let's say, towing the line between what is going to give them too much wear on the plank and what's not. And, well, obviously for Hamilton in China it was too much and he was eventually disqualified, and even then it's not like their performance was especially good. I think the hope for Ferrari will be that what De Kester says is true, that the cause of their issues is something at the rear end. The rear end's a bit too weak. If they tighten that up, they have a better platform that they can base things off, and they can, add significant performance to the car. And, that's the concern. Is it a factor of the car being very sensitive to ride height in terms of aero performance, which of course would be a big concern, and that obviously is true as it stands. But whether there's a fix to that, I guess, is the question, right? Because they have upgrades in the works, and the upgrades are seemingly being, attacking, let's say, this core issue they are currently suffering with. And this will arrive to Bahrain. So Suzuka is happening, of course, the next Grand Prix that is following the weekend after this. Then the next race is Bahrain on the 13th of April, I believe that's the Sunday. So that weekend, that's going to be when many teams, especially Ferrari, will have upgrades in the works. So they will hope, I imagine, to limit the damage in Suzuka, because their car, I don't think, is going to be fastest there. They clearly managed to get it right in qualifying, and they've got to figure out a reason as to how, of course, in sprint quali. And I think they've probably, learned a lot, and will likely continue to learn a lot about the way their car needs to be set up and run. So maybe they'll be better positioned in Suzuka, but I think fundamentally they've got a couple of issues to solve to, especially after the Hamilton disqualification. Not a good sign, really, of things to come for Ferrari this season. My feeling is that there was always going to be one team of the front runners who was taking risk that was going to mess it up. Could have been McLaren, could have been Mercedes, but I think Mercedes were less likely because it felt like they were taking less risk. Could have been Red Bull, but it turns out it is probably Ferrari. However, this may only last a little while. I mean, it's a very, very long season indeed. And let's say Ferrari bring upgrades to the 4th Grand Prix in Bahrain, which puts them right there with McLaren. It's very much championship, very much still alive. But they are intending to bring parts to increase their rear suspension rigidity, or at least fix the problems they're having at the rear, and therefore instability on the long runs. So, the upgrades they're going to bring are targeting the problems they currently have. It's somewhat difficult to say whether this was a planned series of upgrades before the season began and they somewhat expected these difficulties, or whether they are simply adding them in now, given the fact that they realise they have these problems that they need to solve. So very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Just quickly, I thought it was interesting. So Fred Vasseur wanted clarity from FOM, right, Formula One themselves, on the radio messages back in China. So you guys may remember that the radio messages were said in such a way that when Ferrari were saying to Hamilton to swap positions, it was actually Hamilton's initial suggestion to do so, but that that wasn't broadcasted. Now, whether that was done deliberately by Formula One to paint this kind of more entertaining narrative, that is certainly a question. Others would argue that, well, there were other things going on, they simply missed it, and then they broadcast the later communication. F1 say there was no intention of presenting a misleading narrative regarding the Ferrari radio, and that's what they say. So they're trying to reassure Fred Vasseur, but I don't imagine that he's all that satisfied with that. The other piece as well is on what could well be, if Mercedes don't level up, if Ferrari don't level up, a title battle between Oscar and Lando. Of course, Max will always be in the mix as well, you would think, but look, as Lando says, we know that as much as we work together and we have a good time and enjoy ourselves, we both know we want to try and beat each other and show who is best. It's going to be an entertaining title fight this season. Look, my money's on Lando. I think he's outright the quicker driver, but Oscar did have a very impressive Chinese Grand Prix weekend, and Lando was, again, with maybe a little bit of pressure on in certain instances. Now, he'd won the first Grand Prix and was considered the favourite. He's still leading the championship. A little bit of cracks in the armour potentially, and we've certainly seen that before. And the other piece are his thoughts on Verstappen, because as Lando says, even the best driver on the grid needs a teammate to push them to be even better. Now, this is interesting, really, because if you're Max, you don't have a teammate like that, and you never really have. But he has had championship rivals, right? I mean, certainly 2021 and even before to some degree, fighting the Mercedes, and then certainly fighting Hamilton that year. I think they definitely that year, Verstappen and Hamilton pushed the best out of each other as drivers. I mean, there were so many Grand Prix that year. Austin is probably the one to me that springs to mind the most, when they were nearly lapping like the whole field. It was absurd how much more performance they were finding from their cars than anyone else could muster. So, I think that's probably true, but in recent years, Verstappen's still been executing very well, of course, but he's not had a teammate really to challenge him, and I don't know if that will ever really be the case. And maybe Max doesn't necessarily need that if he has a championship rival from another team to kind of push him to be better, but intrigued to your perspective on that in the comments section below. And just to finish out with this, these are then the drivers standing. So Lando's at 44, Max is at 36, George is at 35, Oscar's at 34, then Antonelli, Albon already at 16 here. Then, of course, the two Ferrari men are somewhat further behind the pace. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.